Hey everyone, Richard from Digital Foundry here, and for many this is the Xbox One X patch analysis you've been looking forward to, The Witcher 3 from CD Projekt Red, and the man who's been looking at the game for the last couple of days, Tom Morgan.
This came out of nowhere, but I'm glad it's here, and it came with more than we expected actually. Two modes, a 4K mode and a performance mode, both of which do different things and have different priorities in terms of the frame rate and the visual quality.
Okay, so if we look at the patch notes from CD Projekt Red, essentially we're looking at a 4K 30 mode, which is advertised as native resolution, and then we have a performance mode with an unlocked frame rate that also has an unlocked resolution, which again, a bit of a surprise there.
Yeah, pretty much. The best way to look at it is these two modes define different parameters for the resolution and how dynamic that resolution can be. Obviously with the 30 FPS mode, the resolution can afford to hit a true native 4K, but there's more to it than that.
But to be clear here, it's advertised as a 4K 30 mode, but both modes are actually dynamic, right?
That's right, yeah. So, to give the stats on this, you have the 4K mode, which goes to 3840 by 2160 as the max bounds. That is, you know, looking at the sky, and also, to be fair, generally playing the game in less demanding environments, it's going to be fine to hit the native number there. But you do get drops, and this is probably the best place to test it, in the Crookback Bog area where there's lots of alpha and all the usual stuff that'll test the memory bandwidth of the machine, where you get numbers like 3200 by 1800, that's 1800p as the lowest figure I've found so far.
That's interesting, because on the PC version I was looking to run that game at 4K on like GTX 1060 level hardware, RX 580, I couldn't manage it. I actually had to insert a custom resolution for 1800p to get a consistent 30 FPS, but this goes one better in that if the GPU resources are available, it will scale up the resolution to native 4K, and I think that's great.
It goes in between those two numbers, between 1800p and 2160p. There are definitely values in between those, but yeah, that's the sort of range you're dealing with. Whereas on the performance mode side, obviously that is curtailed in a more aggressive way to hit, well, attempt to hit 60 FPS. We'll cover that in a bit.
Okay, so if we have that 1800p to 2160p window on the 4K mode, to what extent is it actually dynamic in performance mode?
So it seems to operate with 1080p as the lower bounds. That is the worst I've found in places like Crookback Bog again, Heatherton Village where there's lots of snow effects. That's definitely an area where I've seen 1080p in play, but it does go above that, which is an interesting revelation considering. So the number I picked out from a huge sample is 2368 by 1332, so 1332p, which will go some way when you're super sampling it down to a 1080p display to make it look a bit more refined, but it's nothing to really brag about when you're putting it on a 4K display.
I think fundamentally this one is probably best suited to a 1080p screen, but well, it all comes down to how closely it can hit that 60 frames per second target, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But in the here and now, let's talk about the visual feature set, because it's not just the resolution and the frame rate that divides the two.
No, that's true. For starters, we are getting better ambient occlusion, textures and shadows in general, and texture filtering of course, and it brings it, broadly speaking, up to par with the Pro version when you're running in the 4K mode. Now in performance mode, the texture quality stays the same as the 4K mode, but texture filtering is radically reduced in quality, as is shadow quality as well.
It's kind of like a hybrid of sorts between the standard Xbox One version running at a higher resolution, and it has some of the goodies from the new mode as well.
That's right. The draw distances stay the same, effects work stays the same between the two modes, and indeed the Pro version as well. So there's nothing to really differentiate those three ways of playing the game.
Staying with the Xbox One X mode comparisons, let's go back to the performance and take a look at what's going on there.
Well, it's fairly straightforward. This is our standard sort of test run. We use it on PC as well, around the outskirts of Novigrad, through the center, and the results are probably the lowest here out of anywhere I've seen in the game, and it's expected really, given this is the target area for CPU stress tests.
So we've got the unlock frame rate mode there, but I think it's pretty clear that CPU is our major constraining factor there, and we're hitting sort of 40 to 45 frames per second. Personally, not the way I'd like to play the game. But that said, there are other areas outside of Novigrad where, you know, it does a pretty good fist of hitting 60 frames per second.
Before we go there, it's worth mentioning that you can play this game in a similar sort of performance mode if you play it without any patches installed. Obviously, Xbox One version of Witcher launched on disc with no frame rate cap. So to play it on the Xbox One X, you have horsepower of the machine to try and get to 60 FPS. And basically what we've got here is equivalent to that. It runs a bit slower because the settings are a bit higher, but generally it's roughly on par with what you had if you had nothing patched.
You got to hand it to CD Projekt Red here. Obviously there was some coverage from the likes of NX Gamer and VG Tech who took a look at the performance profile of the unpatched game, and a lot of people were quite excited by the fact that you could run this game at up to 60 frames per second. Personally, not the way I'd want to play it because the performance profile is so variable. But at the same time, you know, possibly if you have a FreeSync screen, it should look pretty good there. And of course, some people just want those extra FPS. And I kind of get the idea that CD Projekt Red got wind of the kind of hype surrounding this sort of hidden high frame rate mode and decided to add it to the patch. And you know, good on them. It's nice to have that option for those who want it.
If we're talking about 35 FPS as the lowest point when you're playing in areas like Novigrad, then maybe it's not worth playing it like that. I mean, it's at that point a bit of a lost cause, but most of the game, in fairness, does actually play quite smoothly, well, within the sort of 50 to 60 FPS region. And there's also the fight against the Griffin, which is a good kind of litmus test for general gameplay in a big open area, not too much geometry or anything like that. And again, it comes very close to locking at 60 FPS. Not perfect by any means, but you know, definitely getting there. So it's a real mixed bag. You know, if you go anywhere complex like Novigrad, expect massive drops, but the rest of the game looking pretty decent, though not optimal.
4K 30 mode though looks pretty good from my perspective.
Yeah, clearly there's enough headroom, and the fact that it's running between 1800p and 4K to get to 30 FPS lock, that's a pretty good deal, I think. And bear in mind, there's no checkerboarding to be seen here, which brings us on to the PS4 Pro comparisons, because obviously PS4 Pro, the patch came out way in advance of this one, and they had a checkerboarded 4K. It gives a decent impression of 4K and looks great on 4K sets, whereas Xbox One X is trying to gun for the real thing, and clearly performance isn't an issue there.
Yeah, it's an interesting choice of priorities there, because that 3840 by 2160 checkerboard on the Pro is locked, right? There's no dynamic scaling there.
That seems to be the case, yeah. It was always gunning for a 4K checkerboard.
But on the flip side, the Xbox One X does have native resolution, but it is using dynamic scaling, which I find fascinating.
There's not much to really divide the two versions. You get all the enhancements that Pro got in the first place. The ambient occlusion appears to be of the same quality. Texture filtering, same again. There is a difference in shadow quality though that bears mention. Definitely Xbox One X gets sharper shadows, clearer in the distance mainly, but generally these two worlds look roughly the same in terms of the general settings. It's just the resolution that's the main divider.
So what is the actual difference in terms of image quality between Pro and the Xbox One X? Because obviously we're dealing with native resolution versus checkerboarding here, and that comparison produces varying results depending on the game, depending on the implementation. So how does that work out here?
It's bizarre because you'd obviously expect the Xbox One X to be sharper generally, but what I found is in places the PS4 Pro looks sharper despite using checkerboarding. There's a sense it is just a bit crisper, and then you look closer and then you realize it's because there's not so much post-process AA over the top of what it's doing. There's a lot of very raw looking jagged edges and outlines to trees and that sort of thing in the distance. Looking at both, I think the Xbox One X does win out overall, but it's not an exact comparison because there's clearly something more going over above the actual raw pixel count these two machines are pushing out.
And I think that's good news overall, because essentially both versions of the game are getting excellent implementations worthy of a 4K panel.
Perhaps the biggest advantage though Xbox One X has over PS4 Pro, and despite it running at a technically higher native resolution, is in performance. Now, as you remember, PS4 Pro does struggle to hold 30 FPS at all times. It even fell below the standard of the base PS4 when it came to areas like Crookback Bog. So if we throw both machines at that area, you're clearly seeing a big divide between the two. Despite the resolution differences, Xbox One X seems to be winning on both fronts, image quality and performance, which is a real feat.
Yeah, I mean, if there was one drawback to that PS4 Pro patch, it was the fact that running the original game under boost mode did produce faster results, right?
It did, yeah, and I wonder if we're going to get a similar Pro patch with two modes to kind of accommodate what people want to do with the game.
Yeah, I mean, there is going to be a new PlayStation 4 patch coming along imminently, but thus far the only thing that's been confirmed for it is HDR rendering, which is added to the Xbox One X version by default. And so this leaves the PC version kind of, lacking in that department, which is surprising bearing in mind CDPR's PC focus. So fingers crossed that PC users will get the HDR option too in the fullness of time.
Well, I certainly hope PS4 Pro does get some sort of parity when it comes to at least the mode selection. I think having a 1080p performance mode would be nice, and certainly from my perspective, it'd be interesting just to see on a technical level how it works out. I must say, having tested this game over the last year or two and seeing the performance almost permanently capped to 30, finally having a 60 FPS mode and knowing just what the hardware is capable of has been a real breath of fresh air. So I'm really glad it's there, even if it's not the most practical way to play the game.
So overall then, a really good effort on the Pro, and it looks like the developer has taken it to the next level on the Xbox One X.
I think that about covers it though. If you did enjoy this analysis and want to see more coverage of Xbox One X, please do give us a like or subscribe. And this video is fully encoded at 4K, so if you want to see that at its source file quality, we have that on our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net. But until next time, thanks for watching.